I should warn you, I've actually never done this before, so I have no idea. Like, it might be horrific. Be prepared to do a lot of editing, very possibly.
Podcast Junkies, episode 137. Welcome back. Did you enjoy last week's episode with Amanda Dowdy as much as I did? You must have heard us laughing throughout the whole episode. She's such a bundle of joy and energy, and she's just as much fun in person, and I can't wait to reconnect with her. So if you missed that, check that out. She's the host of the Great Beer Adventure podcast, and we talk about all her adventures getting the show started and the fun that she's been having going to conferences. It was just wide-ranging and really fun, so make sure you check out episode 136. This week, we have a conversation with Claire Duffy. Now, Claire is new to podcasting, and I didn't realize just how new she was until we started getting deep into the conversation. We connected via Twitter, and sometimes I just get naturally curious when I see interesting shows, even if they're not that old. Claire's got a handful of episodes in the can. What I think was interesting for me is this idea of shining a spotlight on the women of Hollywood land, as she likes to say. I don't know if many people know that the Hollywood sign used to actually say Hollywood land until the land piece fell down, and now it just says Hollywood. So it's a great podcast, and it uncovers some really, really interesting women who were some heavy hitters back in the 1910s and 1920s, and it focuses on those female filmmakers and directors and really pioneers in that time. So it was interesting to understand what motivated her to start the podcast. She's a great screenwriter. I think it's in her genes to take something on and have the belief that she can start it on her own. And all she did for the podcast was to watch videos, which is really interesting. And we talked through the journey of that. And I'm really excited that she saw a need to communicate a topic that she was really passionate about. And she took it upon herself to start the show. So kudos to her for that. We talk about the first time she considered screenwriting as a career, how her fascination with films started, where she went for information to get her podcast up and running. We talk a little bit about the first podcast she ever heard. And then we dive into what to expect down the road with the women of Hollywood land. So please check that out. A new podcaster, but definitely a veteran in her own right. This episode is brought to you by Podbean. I wanted to dive into the Patron program on Podbean. It's a seamless way for fans to support you directly from your podcast, and you can instantly receive recurring payments. Now, regular listeners may get this slightly confused with Patreon, which is Patreon.com, which is a separate standalone site. But as a member of Podbean and as a customer of Podbean, you get to participate in their own program, and that's found at patron.podbean.com. So a couple of features are that you can set up a recurring income stream, you can customize the pledge amounts, and it's free to set up. There's no fee at all to set it up, so you can actually raise funds directly from the podcast app. Head on over to podbean.com/podcastjunkies and click on the Patron program at the top to get more information. Full show notes will be available at podcastjunkies.com/137. Make sure you stay till the end of the episode where I reveal this week's retention hashtag, thanks to all who are playing along. But for now, enjoy my conversation with Claire. Claire Duffy, welcome to Podcast Junkies.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So so you just mentioned that this is the first time you're doing is it a first time podcast interview?
Yes, it is. I think it might be my first interview at all, actually. So congratulations.
How is that possible? How is it possible that you've never been interviewed in your illustrious career?
Well, possibly because I've been a screenwriter up until now, and nobody really gives a monkeys about screenwriters at all. We're pretty much this sort of a non. I always think there was a scene in Friends. I don't know if you remember. It was when Joey was on that soap opera, and there was a scene where he was saying something about the writers. And it cut to this like shadowy room where all you could see was like fingers on a keyboard and they, I don't know, took some revenge on his character or something. And I was like, yeah, that's how the world sees screenwriters. Basically, we're just like shadowy fingers on a keyboard being bitter, which is about right.
Yeah. But so when did you decide that was even something you would consider as a career?
But screenwriting,
yeah.
It kind I was kind of always wanting to go into the industry. I've been obsessed with film and TV and theatre. Honestly, do you know, I'm actually just thinking about this now, but I wrote a spec script for 90210 when I was in the 6th grade, which was the first year, 7th grade it must have been, I'm not quite that old. We lived in the States, and it was like the first summer we lived there that it started, and I was like, oh, this is how I'm going to learn how to be an American. And for some reason, I was just so fascinated with it that I sat down and I kind of wrote, which I suppose really it was fan fiction before, I don't even know if fan fiction existed in the early 90s, and I had this like whole fantasy that I was going to send it off and they were going to let me come to California and write the show. And so probably I was kind of always going to be a screenwriter from then. I went to drama school and I studied directing. So I worked in theatre in London for the first couple of years. And then I thought up an idea for a TV show, which now I think about it was very much like 90210, but set in London. And I was just so taken with the power in a way of just creating characters and being able to do anything that I wanted with them. And then about 3 months after that, I applied to film school in Vancouver, and I've been a screenwriter ever since.
Wow, that's some story. What's interesting for me is that you never. I don't know if do you think about the journey that it's taken you so far? Because when you first thought you had this vision in your mind of what you saw on TV, or as a fan of the movies, so do you think that's something that and think about where it might take you, or just are you the type of person that just goes with the flow?
Probably a bit of both in some ways. And in fact, my journey in some ways, I think over the past, it's been over a decade that I've been working as a screenwriter. When I say working, I don't buy an awful lot of stuff with screenwriting money, but I have a career. Probably the journey, I started off not thinking about it as a career or an industry where you get, promotions and that kind of thing. It was all about the make-believe for me. It's always just been about creating characters and making them do things that I loved. And I think then when I started actually working in the industry and I got my first agent and I had my first couple of options, then all of a sudden I was like, right, what's Channel 4 going to be buying, or what's this new Netflix thing? And I started becoming this real career screenwriter, and it took so much of the joy of writing away from me because I wasn't just making up stories, and I'm really, really motivated by working with actors as well. I kind of say I have a crush on just actors in general, all of them. I'm so in awe of what they do, and so for me it's a lot about creating characters that amazing actors can play and can put their creativity into. And I lost that for a while. And then a couple of years ago, I made a choice that I wasn't, I still screenwrite and I still have some projects in development, but I started looking into other things like podcasting, for example, and created this sort of patchwork career so that I could sort of get away from this idea of climbing the industry and could just go back to when a story comes to me that just feels like it has to be on screen, then it becomes a screenplay. Yeah. And if not, then it might be a podcast.
What is your earliest movie memory?
Oh, that's a tough one. My very earliest, do you know, it was probably Annie. And the reason for that is that in the early 80s, mid 80s, my family bought a VCR, although it was actually a Betamax that I don't think they even exist anymore. And we went to our local video shop. This is a town called Bridge of Weir in Scotland. And for some bizarre reason, my dad and I went and we decided that we were going to work our way through the children's section, starting with A. And so the first movie we rented was Annie. And I suppose I must have been to the cinema before then, but for whatever reason, that's the first one that sort of pops to mind when you ask the question. And I remember sitting there howling at it. You do the bit where she gets taken away from Daddy Warbucks and goes with the Hannigans, and I just honestly I was like my whole body kind of racked with sobs, and I think that was the first time that it really hit me that the power of any story, but particularly a screen. I think somehow seeing it, and you just get it's such a 3D experience, hearing the actors' voices and seeing their expressions, and you get caught in the story. So yeah, I think that's probably the first time that I was like, oh, the movies.
The movies, yeah. I think everyone has that memory because we're so small and the screen's so big, so everything is just gigantic to us. So that, because we connected because of your podcast, Women of Hollywoodland, and obviously you can tell that you are incredibly passionate about the film industry. And so this is, after our long introduction, this is the roundabout way of coming, tying it all back into the podcast.
It's always a roundabout way with me. I should have warned you, maybe.
Well, you'll come to find that that's how most of these episodes go, because I tend to follow threads, and I just, when they're presented, I pull them because I'm interested in seeing where they go. So when did you, I just want to go one more question on just your love and knowledge, because you can be passionate about films, but you seem to almost take it to a scholarly point of view from the amount of information that you presented. So it's not just, the nostalgia, but it's also the rich stories that are behind it. So was there a moment when you felt like that transition where you were just a fan of it to now felt like you needed to be a student of it?
I'm not sure if there's one. It was probably a bit of a process, actually. I've been fascinated with the birth of cinema since. It's kind of awful, actually. I've kind of got this, feminist podcast, and the reason that I got into that period is so unfeminist. I was in love with Robert Downey Jr. when I was 12, and so I went to see the movie Chaplin. Actually, I snuck out of school, I remember distinctly, and went down and saw it. And just this idea of the industry that I was already fascinated by. This was probably around the same time I was writing the spec script of 90210, seeing the birth of it and just seeing them making stuff up that we just kind of take for granted, as has always been. So that kind of started off my fascination with the birth of cinema in the 1910s and 1920s. And I've just read voraciously about it ever since. And I am a bit of a history geek in general. Like, that's sort of my go-to relaxing read is usually a book on some period of history, which is how cool I am. And so I guess I've always come at it from a slightly academic perspective. And when I started planning out the podcast, I listened to a lot of podcasts around the period. And with a couple of exceptions, one of the things that really frustrated me about podcasts, and actually a few of the books I've read too, is that people just state, oh, blah, blah, blah happened without explaining what their source was or where that comes from. And there's so many rumors and misinformation. And sometimes there's been like the official studio version of a given story that people accepted at the time, but actually has since been debunked. But then I hear people telling the story that they thought at the time. And I'm like, no, actually, we know better than that now. And you need to kind of acknowledge that. So it was really important to me that this podcast had, I don't know if I quite reach an academic level of sources, but I wanted to really say, okay, this is the information I have, and this is where I got it, and this is why I believe this version, but you might think differently. Because the fact is, I don't know everything. Like, I wasn't there, I can't, but nobody does, you only know kind of what you read. So yeah, I guess it sort of two threads of interest kind of like came together, my obsession with film and obsession with history, into one podcast.
Well, that's a third passion, right? Because you had the blog initially, right? And the website. So can you talk a little bit about that journey when you decided to put it on in writing, and then where that went and where that content is headed?
Well, that's something that I've been playing with. I actually started off with this whole project with a screenplay. It was actually the first screenplay that I wrote when I was at film school, was set in this period, and it was about, like a young female filmmaker and how she was going to make it. And if there's anybody listening who knows anything about the film industry, they'll understand why a brand new writer with this like historical epic wasn't great for the old career thing. So for years and years and years, I've sort of put this whole thing aside and just been like, oh, it's just my hobby. Like, there's no way I'm ever going to sell it. Just put it to one side. But it almost became this, like if I was frustrated with something else I was writing, or if I was afraid that I was falling out of love with the industry a little bit, like if I had, I don't know, a rejection that hit hard or something, I would like treat myself to a day working on this. Like, it's been my sort of like my happy place for a long time. Kind of, yeah. And sometimes, yeah, I skip to the dessert because you just, yeah, you have to. And I think you just have to keep that joy in storytelling and filmmaking, or else you're just dead in the water. So it's something that I've built and built for a really, really long time. And then I think I've started a blog on it quite a few years ago, but I never quite knew what the direction was. I think it was very general, and then I tried doing a kind of fiction blog. So I've been toying with different ideas for quite a long time. And then it started to kind of come together, and I realized what my take on it, which was that I really specifically wanted to focus on the female filmmakers and the fact that nobody knows that they ever existed anymore. And the funny thing is, it started as a podcast in a total whim. Like, I was writing this blog and, I was pretty happy with it, and it was starting to say some things that I wanted to say. And there was, a handful of hits that were starting to build. And I think I was listening to a podcast and I suddenly thought, I'm going to see if I can do this. And within, I think, 24 hours, I'd put up the first episode and I was like, oh, I don't even know how to do a podcast. What am I going to do next? Oh, right. Oh, I wasn't expecting this. Okay. Oh, here we go. So yeah, that's kind of how the podcast, and that's the reason that I think I put out 3 or 4 episodes, and then I had to stop and learn how to do a podcast and then kind of come back and start again.
It's so funny because we talked about it in the email exchange, but I normally wait till I have people that have been doing it for a while. But I just thought it was so interesting that the topic that you picked, and because I think if I don't have like a million listener platform, but I have a little bit of a platform, and I think sometimes there's opportunities to spread a message that, especially in this environment, in our current environment, I think, every little bit helps. So I thought it was really cool. And some of the stories that you were telling, I'm sure would be news for anyone.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's, I'm so glad that you did find me, because I'm just figuring out how on earth this, I've been really gratified and really thrilled at the amount of people that have been listening so far, and I've got some comments and emails, and I'm a bit like, oh, there's people out there in the world listening to my stories. This is amazing. But I'm very, very much at the beginning and very much learning as I go on. But one of the reasons that as I've been explaining, I've always been obsessed with this topic for a long time, but it amazes me how topical it is, because it comes up every few years. There's this whole, we have to get women into Hollywood, and like Wonder Woman just a couple of months ago, it was like this thing, hold on a minute, there can be female dominated films and they can be quite good and people can watch them, and what? It's this whole kind of shock. And so I'm always like, this isn't new. The industry started with this incredible creativity that anybody who was creative, and I think it fascinates me so much. Like, having been a female filmmaker myself, I went through film school, and I just remember accepting that it was like a guy thing to do, that I was like intruding in this male world. And I wouldn't say that I personally really experienced feeling a great deal of like unwelcomeness, but I did feel like a novelty. I did feel a bit like this sort of pioneer, one of this new generation of female filmmakers. And then I discovered that like my great grandma's age were totally ruling Hollywood. So it's a subject that's fascinating to me on so many levels, including quite personal.
Do you find that you're normally a self-starter and a ready, fire, aim type of person? Because it seems like that's the approach you took with the podcast. And I think it almost speaks to your desire to get your voice heard, took over any fear you might have had about not knowing what to do.
I think that's exactly it. Yeah, I think if anything, I'm possibly a little bit too ready, steady, go, because there's times that I'm just like, there's a project that just grabs me, and we'll just sit and I'll do it and I'll get it out there, and then I'll go, oh, I should have done 5 more things that if I just taken half an hour to learn how to do this. Because I think the first episode, I actually ended up taking it down and replacing it, because it was just, I don't think I even had a mic at that point. I think I ran to Amazon, quick, one needs a mic in order to podcast. That's kind of always been my approach, and maybe partly because I've always had this idea of being this sort of pioneer type. It's almost like there's no rules for women in the film industry because there are no women in the film industry. Whereas maybe like guys of my age would have looked at Steven Spielberg or George Lucas and been like, I want that career. I want to copy what they did. I didn't really have those, not to the same extent at least. And so in some ways it's a thin argument. I wouldn't say it's positive that there are so few women in the industry, but if you are going to take a positive from it, it's that sometimes it just feels like, well, you know what? I have things I want to say, and I'm just gonna figure it out. And it's all a little bit Wild West in a way.
So can you talk? I'm sure there are people that are curious because I know that there's people that normally listen to podcasts and several podcasters who listen in. But there could be someone who's passionate about a topic and, is thinking, what am I going to get myself into? So if you could just those few couple of weeks leading up to it, like where did you start going for information and to get you started?
Honestly, probably YouTube tutorials was and I think I literally Googled how to do podcast. And I mean, I listened to a lot of podcasts, and so I kind of had a bit of a sense because sometimes they talk a little bit about their process. And so I sort of felt like I had a vague idea. And I guess, I've worked a little bit in radio drama as an assistant producer like a million years ago. So I had a vague sense of some of what would be involved. And yeah, I pretty much just searched steps for doing your podcast, and then I think I learned to audio edit on a YouTube tutorial. I wish I could find the link actually because it was brilliant. It was like 12 minutes and I was like, boom, done.
That's interesting because I think people they overthink it sometimes, and it's just a testament to not only that your willingness to get it out there, but probably the way I think I found it is just because I try to engage on several platforms, but then I saw how niche your subject was. And again, maybe it's because it's the first one I found, or the fact that, someone who wasn't even originally from this country has such a passionate love for American film, is another interesting story in and of itself. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the response has been, because from the time it's been out and the fact I think we're at 6 episodes, it must have resonated with some people for them to reach out so early.
It seems to have, which has been really thrilling. I mean, as I think it's pretty like teeny in terms of downloads and number. To be honest, I don't even know how you can tell how many people listen to your podcast. Like that's where I'm at. I don't even.
Where
maybe
there's. Yeah, where are you hosting?
Libsyn.
Okay.
Libsyn, and that I got from like Google where to host podcast. What does one do?
Well, that's a good one actually. I'm good friends with them,
okay.
And I've had a couple of folks from Libsyn actually on this show, so they're good.
Oh,
they're
really?
good. Yeah, they're good people. Rob and Elsie, they have their own podcast, so.
I should check that out.
Yeah.
There could be a lot of information I could learn. So
they'll be happy to hear that. But it's funny because we normally don't get into the technical specifics of it, but the fact that you mentioned that you didn't even know or remember, it was just funny, just as a reminder to the listeners, like exactly just how how few time you've been doing this.
Yeah, I think it was March I put the first one up, or towards the end of March, and I just came across, and again, I wish I could remember exactly where it was, but it was about marketing podcast. I was like, okay, I've got a handful of episodes. I'm going to see what I can do to try and get the word out there a tiny bit. And I came across an article from a very successful podcaster, who again, I wish I could remember. I've saved the link somewhere. But he said something like, when I first started, I got 1,000 downloads in my first 6 months. And I was like, right, I'm going to make sure at least I've done that. And I just have. So I'm like, yes, I'm like 1,000 downloads in 4.5 months.
Congrats.
So I'm winning.
So you were talking about you're about to start talking about the response. Yeah.
Yes. I started an Instagram around the same time. It was originally I was going to do this Instagram where I just wanted to post pictures of these women. And I think it was actually as I started to get a handful of comments on that, and I didn't even know that there was women directing in this period, that I think it was it was all within a few day period, but I was like, oh, I'm going to do a podcast on it. So that's kind of been my main sort of channel so far. And some of the responses have just been amazing, that it's mostly been, I had no idea that these women existed, and why don't more people know about this? And I'm like, I know, I agree. And one thing I've been really, really, really thrilled to hear is people appreciating that there is, you can kind of tell that there's a bit of research has gone into it. So that's been really positive as well. And a little bit on Twitter, but my personal Twitter is such a mismatch of everything that I don't think anyone who's interested in my work would have a clue what I was on about half the time.
Yeah, I think people will have their own preferred channel for getting connected with you, and I think the topic lends itself well to photos as well. Mm-hmm. So people can relate to that, and that may speak to why it's so popular on Instagram. But I feel like it's almost a matter before it makes its way into the ears, if you will, of some of the women directors who are making a name for themselves now. So I wouldn't be surprised if maybe we can put the positive intentions out now that some of the bigger names would give it a listen.
I hope so. There's been, I would say, probably, I can't be certain exactly, but at least half, possibly the majority of my followers on Instagram, I think are female filmmakers in various guises. Some directors, some screenwriters, quite a lot of producers. So I think it is something that very instantly resonates with women who, like me, have probably worked their whole lives with this awareness of we're invading in like guy territory, to all of a sudden be like, oh, hold on a minute, there's this whole other world that we didn't know about. It's almost in some ways, I think, the prehistory of Hollywood. That's people think of old Hollywood like Audrey Hepburn and Cary Grant, but they were like the grandkids of the period that I'm talking about. So I think that other female filmmakers definitely seem to be quite excited when they come across it. But I think film is so universal. Everybody, whether you're like a film fan or not, we all go to the cinema, we all watch TV. And the films that are being made, I think they set the sort of the conversation in so many ways. I mean, look at the Ghostbusters, look at Wonder Woman. It brought up so many conversations about feminism and about what women are supposed to be, and the roles for women and the places for women. So I think that in theory, anybody should be concerned with who's making the films that are setting the global conversation, really. Mm-hmm. So hopefully, in theory, everybody will want to listen to my podcast.
And have you been connecting with any of or any people who are podcasting as well? Because I don't know how much into the community you've stepped into, but it's a really generous community, and they're always willing to give back. So I don't know if you've started down that process of connecting with other podcasters.
I haven't really yet. That's probably next on my to-do list to kind of try, because it seems to be that way, and I feel like I'm like kind of like the new kid at the edge of the party, being like, does anyone want to come and play with me? Because I'm addicted to podcasts. I subscribe to like 1,000 and I listen to them constantly. And there's so many that I'm like, oh, maybe they'll be my friend, or they'll be my friend, or and actually, funnily enough, I had drafted out an email to just kind of make a start, just reaching out to a handful of podcasts that I listen to that I think maybe there'd be a bit of crossover with people who'd be interested in mine. And I was about to start sending it when I realized it was the 4th of July and you were all a wee bit busy with your hot dogs and things.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll do that next week.
Yeah. Where's home for you?
Scotland.
Scotland. And how often do you get, or have you been to the States?
Well, I grew up in the States. I lived in Connecticut when I was 10 till 15, I think, about. And I still have family over there. So, every few years. The last time was about a year and a half ago. My cousin got married in Savannah in Georgia, which was stunning. Nice. Yeah, I'd never been to that part of the world. I went like 10 days early, and I went down to New Orleans, and I very nearly never left. I want my ashes scattered in New Orleans. Like, it's phenomenal.
Yeah, we tend to think of it as a separate country sometimes.
Yeah, that was actually because it fascinated me about it. I was like, this is so unique. It's not American, yet it's not American.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal. I could talk to you all night about New Orleans. So I did a train trip actually around that kind of corner last 2 Novembers ago.
Okay.
And I'm not sure when the next one is going to be actually. Actually, I have a movie that's just had a semi-confirmed shoot date, as much as indie film has ever confirmed, which is basically never, for next spring, which should be in Canada. But I think I'd probably try and get a little American trip in there if I'm allowed to go to the set, hopefully.
Well, what you'll find is if you step into the podcast community with both feet, there's conferences, right? And then so there's podcasting conferences. We're heading to one here in Anaheim in August called Podcast Movement, and there's going to be about 2,000 podcasters, and it's just all people like,
That's amazing.
Yeah, our whole community is there, and just, we learn about everything related to podcasting, from the editing to production to marketing. And it's gotten so big that the big names have shown up to speak. So Mark Maron, Sarah Koenig, just
wow,
who's who of podcasters. So it's a 3-day podcasting nerd fest. So.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I think I would choose that over like Comic-Con. Like, that sounds fantastic.
So do you remember the first podcast you heard?
Do you know, it may well have been Serial, actually, or at least the first that I really listened to and got into and suddenly went, oh, that's what this podcasting thing is. It was either that or possibly the self-publishing podcast. I follow that because I'm also kind of starting to dip my toe into indie authoring a little bit. And I came across them, probably around the same time. So yeah, one of those two kind of big ones that I may have listened to the odd episode beforehand, but finally understood the brilliance of what a podcast could be.
I think what's so interesting and engaging, especially when you first come across it, is how intimate it is, and how, because of the nature of how we consume it. We consume it with our earbuds on, and we're usually alone. So it's this almost like one-on-one conversation that's happening, because that's the nature of the medium.
Oh, exactly. There's something I've been blogging in various capacities for almost as long as there's been blogs, I think. And we kind of had that in blogs to begin with. And then I feel like it's lost it a little bit. I think so many people went off and became, famous and millionaires through blogging. I didn't, by the way. But it's sort of, it feels like podcasting has stepped into that niche, but then also, as you say, because if someone's speaking, you can hear them talking, you can hear them hesitate and think and even cough sometimes if they're as bad an editor as I am. I think I did one of my episodes when I had a cold, and I got to the point when I was editing that I could actually recognize a sniff by the sound waves. Like,
that's what happens.
Took me,
yeah.
I was a bit like, I don't think I ever wanted to know what my sniffs looked like, but now I do. So that's something podcasting has given me.
That's hilarious. Yeah, the coughs and the ums. There are definite patterns there. What you have to be careful of is not get overzealous, and you cut it out. So when you listen to it, it sounds like the person isn't breathing, and that's even creepier. So I think early podcasters make that mistake. They try to make it super clean, but that's not what people sound like when they're talking. And you want to hear someone take a breath as they're about to say the next thought.
Exactly. Yeah, you just have to. Yeah, there's that happy medium between grossing listeners out with whatever's going on in your sinuses, and not sounding like a vampire. You wouldn't want to. Actually, I probably would listen to a podcast from a vampire. That'd be fabulous. I'm
sure there's someone who I've heard almost every iteration. You've heard of the Don't Sleep with Me podcast, where the guy drones on, and he reads everything in like monotone. And he puts people to sleep.
That's genius.
And it's a top-rated podcast. He just keeps.
Oh, no wonder.
Yeah, he reads
that's amazing.
Warranties and just the most boring text ever and the most monotone voice ever.
Oh my gosh, that's fantastic! I'm going to subscribe to that like now. Because one of the things that I think is really fascinating about the whole podcasting thing is also that it's a new medium, but radio's been around for a century, commercial radio. And so that's one of the things that I kind of I love about turning my subject into a podcast, because radio was king in the 20s. Nobody had a TV yet, and they went to cinema as much as they could. But the radio was kind of the thing that was in somebody's living room that the family would crowd around in the evening, the way we do around the TV. And so there's something so classic and so real about the oral tradition, that it's so exciting how we're kind of doing it in this really modern way with podcasting as well.
Yeah. What I thought was interesting is when you hear things on your podcast about the movie history that you're surprised about. And one of the things I think I was listening to today was the fact that when movies were first made, there was no thought about an archival process for them, right?
No, and that's one of the most heartbreaking things. Like the amount of times you read these incredible Hollywood history books, and they're like, and that's a lost film, and that's a lost film. But yeah, I mean, the first generation of filmmakers, the majority of them came from vaudeville and from theatre. And of course, one of the amazing things about theatre is once the run of a play is finished, that's it. That's all it was ever meant to be. And that's how they thought of films to start with. So I found that fascinating, that there was this mentality that you made a film and then you took it out sort of on tour, effectively. It wasn't that you had, mass distribution like we have today. That actually was invented by a woman, Mary Pickford. And once the film was over, it was like, right, throw that in the bin. That and the fact that it was made of nitrate, which is incredibly flammable. So I think it was Mary Pickford. There's an interview with her from like the 60s or 70s. I think it's on YouTube, where she talks about the fact that she was asked by Hollywood historians in the 60s or something, have you got any of your old films? She was like, yeah, they're all here in my my attic or whatever. And she opened the box and they were just dust. Because that was what they made film out of in those days. If it didn't catch on fire, it crumbled into nothing. And it's so heartbreaking when you think of some of the incredible performances and stories and the beginnings of film conventions. The first time a lot of those things were on film, we'll never actually get to see because they've crumbled to dust.
Yeah, it's just interesting, and I guess it makes you realize that there were different times back then, but just appreciate the fact that that we now have a way to almost maybe to the other extreme. We can now record every single piece of information in
That's true.
In perpetuity now. So
it's true. And I think, unfortunately, that's possibly not necessarily unfortunately, because it is what it is, but I think that's one of the reasons that women and actually immigrants as well completely dominated Hollywood in the first couple of decades. It's partly because nobody took it seriously as a business. It was just this mad little thing that people did out in that Hollywood place, whatever that was. And so that's what made it, I think, so open for anyone who just had an idea and could get hold of a camera. So it wasn't until the studio system came and people were like, oh, hold on a minute, Wall Street needs to get involved in investing in these films and we can make money. Then it sort of became legitimate. And then all of a sudden, you needed a man to helm a film if it's going to be legitimate.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that the story's getting out. So I'm wondering, are you, having learned what you learned in the beginning, where you said you had to stop for a little time, do you feel like now that you're ready to tackle this in a consistent fashion and that you have a lot more stories to tell?
Well, I'm definitely not short of material. Like the deeper I get into research for it, it's almost like a sort of spider's web, because I'll be researching one episode and I suddenly see a female name that I've never come across before. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I have to do an episode on her and her and her and her. So I'm definitely not short in material, and I also want to eventually expand into just looking at other aspects of the film industry from a feminist perspective. There were like Victor Hustrom, who was a Swedish director who was quite big in the early years of Hollywood. I think is arguably a feminist director, even though he's a guy. Irving Thalberg. I think arguably also, he really looked after female filmmakers, particularly screenwriters. He seemed to almost prefer female screenwriters. So there's lots of other aspects, or looking at the vamp character, for example, from a feminist perspective, and try and figure out whether she was a feminist or not. That's up in the air. So the short answer is yes, there's millions more stories that I really, really want to tell. for how long or how consistently I'll do it, we'll just kind of see how it goes. If people keep listening and more people listen, then yeah, the sky's the limit, really.
Very good. Well, I think if you keep providing content that's different and as detailed as you do, I think that's probably why you're attracting people who hear this as something different than what's currently out there. Or maybe there is nothing out there like it, which is why people find it fascinating as well.
Possibly. It could be a little bit of both, I think. I mean, there are a handful of early Hollywood podcasts. Obviously, You Must Remember This is kind of the major one, which is fantastic. I'm completely addicted. Although most of the periods that she covers are, again, a little bit sort of 20, 30 years after my period. So there are a handful of podcasts on Hollywood history. And then there are a handful on like women's history or feminism. As far as I've discovered so far, I think I'm the only one to really combine the two in terms of history. At least there's a couple on women filmmakers and women directors. So I've hopefully got maybe a little niche to play in for the moment. So yeah, we'll see. And I think in some ways it's what really excites me about doing it, but then in other ways I guess it's a challenge insofar as each episode it's a big time commitment. It's a good couple of days to pull all together. I mean, it's been 10 years in the research, but to pull together my research and to write the episodes. And so that's probably my biggest challenge, is figuring out whether I can streamline it, or, I mean, I'm a long way off, I think, realistically, having any kind of income from the podcast. So I'll just need to figure that out, because it's a labor of love as well. So I don't think that'll change.
Very good. Well, I definitely caught my ear, so I'm wishing you all the best with it, and I'm hoping you will be consistent with it.
Thank you very much. Well, I've certainly planned to. Fingers crossed.
So we usually wrap up with a couple of questions for every guest. The first one is, what is something that you've changed your mind about recently?
Oh, like in anything?
Yeah, anything.
Oh, I might have to think about that for a moment. Nothing is the only example I can think of, and it's really awful, but for some reason it's what's popping into my mind. I just bought my first paddleboard. I'm a little bit obsessed with stand-up paddleboard.
That's right. I did see that on your website.
Oh, you did? Yeah, it's it's like a growing obsession. And especially because I've now kind of figured out a way that I can actually sit on it and with a notebook, and I can write, and I'm like, this is the way forward. So I bought my very first one, and I bought a blow-up one, which for years I had been told was like, they're rubbish, don't ever bother. And then I went on when I discovered that I'd actually been completely wrong, which is a really rubbish example, but I did change my mind, and I did actually run up to the woman who'd said, oh, these are only blow-ups. I was like, forget it. And then I went back and apologized to her because, yeah, I was proved wrong.
Well, I love asking the question because I get the widest range of answers. I've got, people would, I think so one person said they no longer drink soda, or just just the most random thing. And sometimes they're deep, and sometimes, we go down another rabbit hole, but I always think it's something to make people think.
So that's it. Yeah, I wish I could have thought of something like deeply philosophical or like a political position, but I'm like,
no need to. No, because
that paddle is good after all.
It is. What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
Ooh, well, this is another really shallow answer, but possibly my accent. I totally confused because I grew up in like 4 different countries, depending on who I speak to. I'm actually really focusing right now not to pick up too much of your American accent, because I do that all the time, and then people are like, wait a minute, I thought you were Scottish a minute ago. And I'm like, yeah, but I think because I spent such formative years in the States, and in that time I totally had pure American accent. My parents were like, who are you?
Well, it's so funny you say that, because when you were earlier, you said an example that you were talking to a friend, and you repeated a female name, and I was just struck by how American sounding it was when you pronounced it. I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I thought maybe you're just doing an affectation.
Well, that's the worrying thing. I've actually got in trouble before because people have thought that I've been making fun of them because I'm talking to them. It's just this natural chameleon thing, and I can't stop it. I would quite happily just talk like a Glaswegian all the time, but I actually nearly got like in trouble in a pub in London just last summer. That I was talking to this guy from Yorkshire. I don't know if you know what that accent sounds like. It's like northern, like, I don't know, a bit like Oasis, kind of how they talk. And I kept on picking it up, and I've never been to Yorkshire in my life. And he was all like, "Are you making fun of me?" And I was like, "No, I can't stop it. I'm really sorry." So that's probably the main thing about me that confuses people. Whether it's necessarily they're misunderstanding or I'm just confusing them, I don't know.
Yes, very, very entertaining. I'm sure, yeah, I can see how it could get you into trouble.
It can do, particularly because at the moment I've just moved back to Glasgow. I didn't actually grow up here. I haven't lived here since I was 8. So that actually kind of confuses people, because when I talk to other Glaswegians, I sound like I have never been away, because it's the chameleon thing. And then I don't know my way around the city, and I'm like asking for directions. It's like the equivalent of a New Yorker being like, "Does anyone know where Times Square is?"
Yeah.
I'm kind of like, "Does anyone know where Queen Street Station is?" And they're like, "How can you not know where Queen Street Station is?" And I've got to be like, "Oh, my dad got a job in France, and oh, it's a long story." So
That's funny.
It's a weird affliction. Out of all the afflictions to have, it's an odd one.
Yeah. It's probably a podcast buried in there somewhere as well in your future.
Yeah, possibly. I think there is something really fascinating about the oral tradition, and because I think different accents can give you different personalities. There's even times that I've noticed that I think when I was a teenager, I used to flirt in American. For some reason, it's easier to kind of get that whole like, "Oh, really? Oh, hi. Oh, okay." But then, like, if I was like, when I was directing, I'd be like, "Right, now I'm going to take my London accent and I'm going to, run this room." And I don't quite know what my Glaswegian character is, but I think there is something really interesting about accents and language as well.
Yeah.
That can, I don't know if it changes personality or just changes perception of personality, but something interesting there anyway.
Yeah, probably a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as you might imagine, this has been quite a wide-ranging conversation.
So yeah, I did warn you I'm not big on sticking to subjects.
Yeah, no, it's okay, because this is what the whole mood I'm going for is just the listener pulling up a chair while we're having a conversation, in a bar, and that, because that's really what connects people is like real conversations and natural conversations.
Absolutely. It's something, I love that idea of it. I've been toying with possibly adding a series at some point that would be talking to actor friends about a movie from the period, like one of the few that we're able to actually find. Because one of the great thing is that because a lot of them are over 100 years old, they're in the public domain. So they're actually freely on YouTube. And you can actually, for once, with a clear conscience, say that people can watch them on YouTube. And so I love the idea of we'd watch it together and then kind of break it down and discuss it as a film and discuss whether or not a film like that could be made today. Like there's one I've talked about in the Lois Weber episode that, it was a pro-choice film made in 1916. And that was a major, mainstream Hollywood release. I don't know if that could really be done today. Certainly not without a great deal of controversy. And there was controversy around it. But it was released and it was done. So I love the idea of it, but it frightens me a little bit as well. I think this whole freestyle thing, I take my hat off to you. I'm not there yet.
I think you definitely have your plate full already, based on what seems like a lot of the research that you do for each of the episodes.
Mm-hmm. For the moment.
For the moment. So what's the best place for folks to track you down online?
For this podcast, probably womenofhollywoodland.com.
Okay.
It's pretty simple. Or me generally, csduffy.com.
Well, Claire,
if you're interested in other insanity things I do.
If you found the past 50 minutes entertaining and you want to continue the shenanigans, then that would be the website.
Indeed. Well,
Claire, thank you so much for taking the time to come on. I'm always fascinated by what goes on beyond what we hear on the episodes, which is where I love taking these conversations. The listener knows already. They can go listen to your show and see what you do with that. But a lot of times they don't know what your thought process is or what you were thinking as you were putting these episodes together. So I appreciate you taking the time to come on.
Not at all. Thank you.
So thanks again to Claire for coming on the show. It was really interesting to hear about her podcasting journey and how she was so excited to get started that she just wanted to jump into it and taught herself. And you can see by the things that she spoke about by her career as a screenwriter that this is a self-starter, most definitely. So we are a proud member of Podcastica.com. Head on over to Podcastica, which is keeping me sane with its Game of Microphones podcast as I get through my Game of Thrones season. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil. Don't forget to support our sponsor, Podbean, podbean.com/podcastjunkies. So heads up if you're heading to Podcast Movement in Anaheim, California at the end of this month. Dates are the 23rd through the 25th, if I have those correct. You can get 15% off, which is the best discount available, by heading over to podcastjunkies.com/podcastmovement. And it's a discount for anyone who uses that link. So please, if you've been on the fence and you want to go, please go. I'm love to see you there. It's one of my favorite events of the entire year. And look for the bright yellow shirt as well. Podcastjunkies.com/podcastmovement. If you made it this far, you're no doubt listening out for the retention hashtag. In honor of Claire's podcast, we'll make it Hollywoodland Claire. So it's a bit longer this time. So it's Hollywoodland Claire, CLAIRE. And you can tag Claire at Chill Divine. Cool Twitter handle, by the way. CHILLDIVINE. And of course, us at podcast_junkies. Tune in next week to hear my conversation with Nicole Aboud. She's the host of The Gen Y Lawyer. If you haven't already, don't forget to download our free PDF, 8 Tools to Skyrocket Your Podcast Launch. It's updated for 2017. You can find it at podcastjunkies.com/8tools. And you can either spell it out or put the number in 8 Tools, podcastjunkies.com/8tools. Thanks so much for all the support for the show. Take care and have a fantastic week, guys.